I'm J.G. Michael, and this is Parallax Views.
Hey there, Parallax Views listeners. Independent media matters, and your support makes it possible. If Parallax Views has challenged your thinking, exposed you to new ideas, or simply kept you company on your commute, now's the time to help sustain it. Listen, share, and if you can, support the show on Patreon at patreon.com/parallaxviews. One more time, that's patreon.com/parallaxviews. If you want, you can also make a one-time donation by contacting me at parallaxviewspod@protonmail.com. I can give you a link to my PayPal page if you contact me that way. Let's show what listener-supported media can do.
Excuse me, Laurie.
Oh, Mr. Brackett, I'm sorry, Mr. Brackett.
Oh, I didn't mean to startle you.
That's all right.
You know, it's Halloween. I guess everyone's entitled to one good scare, huh?
Hey there, Parallax Views listeners. We are continuing our spooky season series, this time with a look into the art of screenwriting for serial killer biopics. I know that's a controversial topic, probably, as we delve into the intersection between true crime and cinema. Very hot topic lately, especially with the new season of the show Monster that covered Ed Gein. A lot of controversy around that season of Monster. We're not going to be talking about that, though. We're going to be talking about, well, a number of movies, but chief among them, since I mentioned the Ed Gein season of Monster, the movie Ed Gein from the year 2000, starring Steve Railsback, known for his portrayal of Charles Manson in the TV miniseries Helter Skelter, and directed by Chuck Parello. That movie was written by our guest, Stephen Johnston, who also wrote the screenplay for Matthew Bright's 2002 Ted Bundy pick, aptly named Ted Bundy. I hold that biopic in rather high regard, as I think it does a lot to give a poke in the eye to serial killer groupie culture, and it sort of desexifies, if that's a word, Ted Bundy himself. It does not portray Bundy as Mr. Charisma, far from it. It's a very misunderstood movie, and a movie we'll be talking about in this conversation. Additionally, Stephen Johnston wrote The Hillside Stranglers, starring C. Thomas Howell and Nicolas Turturro. He wrote a number of other screenplays as well, most recently 2025's Ed Kemper, directed by Chad Farron, who is no stranger to the horror genre. All the movies I've mentioned, of course, are all based on real-life serial killers and true crime cases. So, Stephen essentially specializes in this subgenre, and we're going to be talking all about how that works, how he writes these stories, etc. on this edition of the program. I hope you'll find the conversation fascinating. And before we get to speaking with Stephen Johnston, let me remind you that with the exception of my one sponsor, Mike Swanson, this show is entirely listener-funded, so if you can, please consider supporting me on Patreon at patreon.com/parallaxviews. One more time, that's patreon.com/parallaxviews. Also, I mentioned my one and only sponsor, Mike Swanson of wallstreetwindow.com. Head over to wallstreetwindow.com for straight shooting, trading, and financial news. I've had listeners make return on investment from Mike's trading tips, and if you sign up to his newsletter right now, you can get a copy of his book in ebook form for free. That book is The Twofold Formula, the single best trading pattern I have ever used. Well worth reading if you're into stock trading. And of course, I highly recommend his newsletter. It's great for trading and financial news. So, head on over to wallstreetwindow.com. And with that being said, let's get right to it with Stephen Johnston. Welcome to Parallax Views, a guest that I'm very, very excited to be speaking with. I believe it was Brian Yuzna, the great producer that got us in touch. I'm speaking with Stephen Johnston, who is a screenwriter that has worked on such films as Ted Bundy, directed by Matthew Bright, a movie that I'm very interested to be speaking about, as well as movies such as Chuck Parrillo's The Hillside Strangler and Ed Gein, the movie based on the killer Charlie Starkweather, which is just called Starkweather from 2004, and most recently, Chad Farron's Ed Kemper, which only came out just a few weeks ago. He's also one of the people that helped write The Quantum Devil, which is a very interesting little Lovecraftian horror movie from friend of the show, Zeph Daniel. We'll be speaking about all these movies, and how are you doing, Stephen Johnston?
Man. I'm doing good. The movie's doing well, so all things considered, I can't complain too much.
So let's, right off the bat, how did you first get into screenwriting, and are there any misconceptions people have about the screenwriting process?
I'm sure there are many misconceptions that people have. The way I got into it, it's just what I always wanted to do, actually. I quite literally, since I was a kid, I knew I would not just make movies, that I specifically wanted to write them. And I actually went to film school. I went to Columbia College in Chicago, studied screenwriting, and it's just what I always wanted to do. In fact, one of my earliest memories, movie-wise, was that for some reason, the family television was left in my bedroom when I was a child. And unbeknownst to my parents, I stayed up late one night and I watched Frankenstein Meets the Wolfman. And I was so young that I didn't entirely understand kind of what I was watching, but I just sort of knew I wanted to be part of whatever it was. And so I quite literally, I just always, and, I wrote short stories as a kid and, always did well, and specifically when it came to school and English, and it's just what I've always wanted to do. And, so I sort of set myself on that path, and thankfully I've had a little bit of success.
When I said misconceptions, maybe a better word I could have used is, what do you consider, what are the biggest challenges when it comes to screenwriting, at least for you, or in general with screenwriting? What are the biggest obstacles one faces?
Yeah, I guess I didn't mean to be flippant when I said, kind of made a joke about misconceptions. I think partly what I was kind of getting at is the idea, because I used to mentor students through a screenwriting program. And so when you asked me that question, I was sort of thinking about some of the questions I would get, or expectations that students would have about, getting agents, and, how much can I sell my first script for, and things that I'd just be like, well, here's an idea. How about you write it first? Then we'll talk about how much you might get paid for it, that sort of thing. I just think it's like any other form of storytelling. The biggest challenge is correctly telling a compelling story. And that's easier said than done, I think, which is why we see a lot of, bad movies or bad television shows, or, even if you're telling a true crime story that's predicated on actual things that, true stories that actually happened, you still have to figure out how to tell that story. You can't just be like, well, this happened and this happened and this happened. You have to figure out what's your through line. How do you tell a compelling story? So, I mean, to me, the biggest challenge with screenwriting or any kind of storytelling is storytelling.
So there's a sort of through line in a lot of your work. You've done a lot of movies based on serial killers. When I was talking to Brian Yuzna about getting you on the show, he said, yeah, I have this friend who specializes in writing serial killer movies. So I'm just curious, how did you fall into that? Sort of doing these movies based on true crime?
Well, when I was in school in Chicago, somehow I stumbled across the Ed Gein story, because of course Chicago being vaguely, close to Wisconsin, Plainfield, Wisconsin, where Ed Gein happened, and I kind of became interested in the idea that there were all these movies that were loosely based upon Ed Gein, Texas Chainsaw Massacre, Silence of the Lambs, Deranged. And I just sort of thought, I was like, well, if all of these movies are sort of loosely based upon this guy, I should look into his story, because why hasn't somebody just told his story? And so I started researching it and discovered that his story was kind of more fascinating than most of the movies that were based upon him. And I wrote the script when I was in school, In the Light of the Moon, which is what I then sold to Hamish McAlpine, which is what evolved into Ed Gein. That was, of course, directed by Chuck Parello.
And starring the great Steve Railsback, who previously had played Charles Manson in
Precisely,
the great
right.
Helter Skelter TV series.
A little serendipity there. And Carrie Snodgress. And to get back to your original question, so Ed Gein was, quite successful. It won Best Picture at Sitges. I got a couple of Best Screenplay awards at international film festivals, and it just did a great business. And so, to be perfectly cynical about it, you do something like that is successful, they come back and they ask you if you've got another one. And I said, not yet, but give me a couple of months. So, it is it's subject matter that I'm fascinated with, serial killer pathology. But, how did I earn a reputation writing these things? Well, because they're successful.
So it's sort of like when an actor gets really big in a horror movie, like, someone like David Howard Thornton has gotten big with Terrifier. He ends up in a bunch of other horror movies because people know.
It's the screenwriting version of typecasting, basically. It's which is, and I think part of the thing too, I always approached it like I was writing horror movies, because my love is horror movies, so I always approached them that way. And so I just kind of all look at and I've written other things that weren't serial killer movies. But I still kind of approach them as horror. So I think there's a certain amount of genuine love of the genre that perhaps comes through when I'm writing them, even though perhaps what I'm writing is not, the happiest material.
So this is really interesting. You said earlier that you said in some ways when you researched Ed Gein, you found the real story more fascinating than the stories that are loosely based on Gein in some way, whether we're talking about Texas Chainsaw Massacre or Silence of the Lambs or Deranged. What was more fascinating to you about the real Gein than those sort of loose interpretations of him?
Well, just how genuinely, pathological and insane he was. Like when you actually get into the story of him, people they make the mistake of calling him a serial killer, because he really wasn't a serial killer. He killed 2 people. He was a grave robber. And I just found the story fascinating that when after his mother passed away, he became so obsessed with her that he truly thought he could somehow, bring her back from the dead by putting on suits made of other people's flesh and doing, grave robbing and holding these bizarre rituals. And, the Ed Gein story, it's far more fascinating, just the macabreness of it, I guess, than is, I love Texas Chainsaw Massacre. I love Silence of the Lambs. No, don't get me wrong, but, they're almost mundane. Well, at least Silence of the Lambs, it's almost mundane in comparison to the actual story of Ed Gein.
It's interesting. This weekend I was at a horror movie convention, and I was talking to William Forsythe from
sure.
so many movies, The Devil's Rejects, Once Upon a Time in America. But we were talking about his movie, Dear Mr. Gacy. And I said, is it difficult to get into that role? Because he's playing John Wayne Gacy in that movie. And he said to me, the hard part is when you're acting, you can't judge the character. You just have to play the character. You have to portray the character. So I'm wondering, is there something similar that goes on as a screenwriter when you're, writing a character like Ed Gein or a Ted Bundy or the Hillside Stranglers, where you sort of have to understand their mindset and sort of portray how they think?
No, very much so. Very much so. Like, yeah, that's a good way to put it. What did he say? You can't judge the character.
You don't judge the character. You have to portray the character.
Yeah, yeah. No, I think that's because of course, I've been asked versions of this question, and sometimes in perhaps more unkind, suggestions that I'm glorifying serial killers. To which I always respond, I'm not glorifying anything. I'm just telling their story as factually as I can. And I've always sort of prided myself on the fact that I don't make up. I mean, there are certain elements in the script that obviously I have to sort of interpret or infer occurred, because I wasn't there, nor was anybody else. But I always just tell the stories as truthfully as I can. And to exactly that, you can't judge. Let the audience pass their own judgment. So I very much concur with that sentiment that you're not there to judge the character. You're there to, or you could as a writer, obviously, but that's a completely different subject. Then you're writing a different movie than I was writing.
In terms of Ed Gein, what was your takeaway from that movie? I mean, how do you interpret Gein? I mean, is he because on one hand, I almost feel like he's one of the more he's a very sad, sort of pathetic kind of character, and he did horrible things, but I'm not sure it was like, I think he was legitimately insane. I don't know that it was like evil so much as insanity.
Yeah, yeah. Even though the stuff he did was so incredibly macabre and grotesque, and digging up graves and carrying corpses back to his house, it's all incredibly dark and macabre. But it was almost, again, he was doing it because he missed his mommy. So his motivation, if not his actions, certainly weren't evil. He missed his mommy, and so yeah, I think that to a certain degree, I'm certainly not defending any of the things in any of his actions, but he is deserving of a certain sympathy, or at least pity. If he's not deserving of sympathy, well, of course he's dead now. So, but
he's just, to me, he's a very different character than like the Hillside Stranglers, or even like Starkweather. Yeah.
I didn't want to get too ahead of the curve, but I was going to specifically mention Hillside Strangler, that over the arc of like Ed Gein, Ted Bundy, and then the Hillside Strangler, if you sort of look at those characters, if Ed is vaguely sympathetic or pitiable anyway, then you had Hillside Strangler, two extraordinarily unsympathetic characters.
Let's talk a little bit about your collaborations with Chuck Parello, who did Ed Gein, and he also did the Hillside Strangler movie. Chuck has been on my show before. He's a very fascinating guy. What's the collaborative process between you and Chuck on those two movies? How do you sort of get both of your visions in there?
Well, I think if Ed Gein, now you also have to bear in mind that we're talking about things that happened 25 years ago on a couple of occasions. But like I say, the original script for Ed Gein I wrote sort of all on my own and sold it to Hamish McAlpine, and so there was no real collaboration. I mean, in the sense that Chuck and I weren't. I suppose I met Chuck a couple of times on set. But I think, at that point, it was more like passing off the baton and Chuck then doing his own thing. And it was similar with Hillside Strangler, although I think we had a bit more conversations back and forth because we had, sort of worked together previously. But my approach to when I write, by and large, although I have collaborated with people in a couple of respects, including Brian Usna, but for me, I tend to be a very kind of solitary, I lock myself into a room for 2 months and I emerge with a script. So I'm not, don't mean to sound horribly antisocial, but for me, writing's not a terribly collaborative process.
No, I can understand that completely. I think most writers, it's a very solitary activity. In terms of the Hillside Strangler movie and the screenplay, give me an idea of how much research you had to do for. I know we're talking about things that were done, 25 some years ago, but I think it's a really interesting subject to broach. How do you research this? How long does it take to really get down all the fine details? And what creative license do you end up taking?
Well, as I said before, I try not to take creative license, unless it's something I kind of have to. Like again, I wasn't a fly on the wall, so I have to infer or interpret certain things. And of course, we're going back to the vaunted days before the internet. So the way one had to do research was actually hunt down books and newspapers. So that's what I would do. I would just basically find as much stuff as I could. Being in Los Angeles helped a bit because I was able to go down to like the LA library, and I could find LA Times articles and things from back in the day. And basically, the way I would start really, and this might become a little dry. I don't know how much people really want to know about me filling out index cards and things of that nature, but
No, I actually want to hear about this. I love
that's what I would do. Everything would get its own sort of index card, whether it be victims or specific events or like crime locations. And then I just had those cards. So that was a way of compiling all of this wealth of material down. So then I had my index cards. And by the time I had the index cards, I had a pretty good mind of the overall story structure. And then I could just refer to the index cards. And see, the other thing too is that where I lived in Los Angeles, in Los Feliz, that was just, I was 10 minutes away from Glendale, which was where Angelo Buono's trim shop was and where Bianchi's apartment was. A couple of their victims were found about a mile from where I lived. So I was able to actually go to the various locations that I identified anyway, and just sort of steeped myself in it. Kind of goes back to what I mean about like when I talk about it being very solitary, is that's sort of how I just sort of submerge myself in the material, and almost let the story tell me how to write it, if that makes any sense.
No, I think I understand you. Yeah.
I sort of let that dictate how the story gets told or the structure of the story, which, sometimes can be a kind of a bleak place to be, inhabiting that world, specifically with the Hillside Strangler.
Do you think folks may have gotten movies like Ed Gein or The Hillside Strangler, and we'll get to Ted Bundy. That's like the main event for me because I hold that movie in very, very high regard, actually.
Oh, thank you. I've had other people tell me that. In fact, I was interviewed by somebody a couple of weeks ago, and she was telling me that when that movie came out, that her and her friends did that movie quote thing, which I certainly do with my friends, where you quote, you communicate in quotes from movies. Of course, I found it odd that her and her friends did that with Ted Bundy. But
well, what I wanted to ask was, especially with the Hillside Strangler and the Ted Bundy movie, I have seen people say this is moralizing or it's trying to glorify the killers. And I'm wondering what movies those people are watching. Because, I mean, Ted Bundy is portrayed as a pathetic, nose-picking sort of kleptomaniac in the Matthew Bright movie, the movie that you wrote. And then Chuck Parello's Hillside Strangler. I mean, yeah, you got C. Thomas Howell, who's a great actor, that usually plays like roles that, people like C. Thomas Howell. But in that movie, he's playing Kenneth Bianchi, who is a loser,
It was great. And I thought that was great. Like, such fantastic casting. Nick Turturro as well, but specifically with C. Thomas Howell, because it was such against type. And that's a response I've gotten a lot, like at horror movie conventions or things. When if that movie comes up, people specifically mention the idea of like, C. Thomas Howell. Oh, he was so grody. He was so like, that's the thing that specifically they make the specific observation is not just the overall movie, but that C. Thomas Howell was so against type.
Do you think, though, I guess what I was getting at was that I don't see how anyone can come out of those two movies thinking that there's glorification going on. If anything, you're portraying these characters, these criminals, these serial killers in the most, I would say that you're portraying them for what they are, which is very pathetic in a lot of ways.
They're pathetic human being, absolutely, and thankfully I've not gotten that too frequently. I don't doubt that there are people out there that harbor those kind of opinions, but they're not directed at me that often. But my response to that is usually like, So if somehow it would be more respectful if I downplayed how horrible these people were. Um, and it sort of goes back to the like when you watch things on television, say, where it's almost this sanitized, like, oh, a killer walks into a room and camera cuts away and there's a dead body that's discovered the following morning. Like to me, it's sort of like, well, which is sort of more tasteless? The idea that these horrible acts that these characters commit are kind of receive this sort of sanitized storytelling, or that you just show it in all of its brutal horrificness.
Yeah, and I think there's also an element of, like I said, that in between the killings, you see how pathetic these characters are. I think in the Hillside Strangler, it starts out with Nicolas Turturro as Angelo Buono hitting on some woman by saying, "Are you from Wisconsin? Because you smell like cheese." And I'm like, what? This dude is like really pathetic. And it's interesting. I find it odd when people look at either your movies or just Chuck's movies and say, well, oh, are they trying to glorify this? Because I think there's a lot more glorification of serial killers in mainstream media than there are in your or Chuck's films.
Yeah. I think yeah, exactly. And well, like the analogy that just sort of popped into my head is it's sort of like saying, like, well, if somebody makes a movie about like Nazi Germany and Hitler, are they glorifying Hitler? Like, I mean, obviously they could be, but for the most part, like, I don't really, it's hard for me to really comprehend the argument that there are stories that you just can't tell because it's somehow glorifying somebody.
Well, it's not just that, but you guys aren't the one, you're not selling like T-shirts with John Wayne Gacy on it or something.
Right.
There's an actual whole like groupie culture around this stuff that's really weird to me, at least. But that's not what these films are doing at all. How do you go about writing the scenes in between the sort of murder and mayhem?
Well, I guess it kind of goes back to my index card thing, is that once I sort of figure out what those scenes, what the anchor scenes are, then figuring out kind of how to tie those together, and going back to the idea of showing how loathsome or terrible these characters are, how pathetic they are, and what kind of motivates their, then when you see the horrific scene, sort of what motivates that. Like, speaking of Hillside Strangler, I was just thinking about, the great Lynn Shay plays Angelo Buono's mother in that. And in particular, there's like one scene where they just start yelling at have this big argument at the dinner table. And she's talking about like that she's always kind of known he was bad because of some of his own behavior that even, as a mother, she knew was just wrong. Now, see, again, like, I don't know, that was a scene where that's a certain amount of artistic license, because I couldn't have possibly been there for that. But since I knew I wanted to set up the idea that Buono was this sick and depraved character, well, then having him argue with his mother, who I knew he did have a bad relationship with, that's a way to kind of get into his ugly psyche.
So I wanted to get into the Bundy movie. How did the writing of that come about?
I think, if I remember correctly, basically, like I said, that Ed Gein was so successful. I mean, within, relatively speaking, that it was so successful that Hamish and Mike Mescal basically then approached me about doing another one. And
okay. Was Bundy like the first choice, or?
In my memory, and I don't think I was even part of I was more asked like, hey, what do you think about doing a Bundy one? I'm pretty sure that the idea to do Bundy originated with Hamish and Mike, or one or the other. And so then at that point, I just went off and did, the research to write it.
So what was the research process for that one like? Was there anything like, what stood out to you about Bundy's story? Because a lot of times we get this very, I would say almost romanticized picture of Ted Bundy where, oh, he was so charismatic and suave and he could have been a lawyer, but that movie takes a very different tact. And I don't know if that was your original intent or if Matthews sort of did that. I want to delve more into that.
Um, well, Matthew definitely brought a sort of his own kind of dark black comedy kind of a to it a little bit. But again, it's that I don't really know when it started, but that idea, maybe like Hannibal Lecter, but that idea that people seem to have that like serial killers are, above average intelligence, or by and large, that's not true at all. Like they're not. If anything, they tend to be below average intelligence. And Bundy, because of that sort of self-aggrandizing, narcissistic personality, yes, he was a fairly good-looking guy. He was fairly charming, but that's sort of in comparison to guys like the Hillside Strangler. He wasn't really all that charming, nor was he really all that smart, which is why he actually wasn't terribly successful. But that grandiosity that is common with the sociopaths. So I certainly went into it wanting to show that, like, well, no, Ted, you aren't quite the guy that you think you are. And I think that's going back to the idea of people sort of think accusations of glorifying these guys. It's like, no, if anything, I'm trying to take the air, let the air out of the balloon and basically show that, like, no, they're cretins. Now, Bundy was perhaps, if you met Bundy at a party, you might have a beer with him and not walk away thinking like, oh, what a creep, like you would.
But I think if you got to know him, you would be like, okay, there's something
fairly quickly. Yeah. If you knew him after a few days, you'd kind of be like, oh, there's something wrong.
To be honest, even the way he went after women, he would often pretend to be injured and ask for help. There's something. This is a dude that I think Matthew Bright put it once in an interview. This is a dude that started out as a peeping Tom, and then he evolved to beating women with sticks. It's a really like pathetic sort of character, and there is something off about him.
Well, and one of the books that I did read was The Phantom Prince, I think it was called, which was actually written by his former girlfriend, one-time fiance.
Oh, the one that's portrayed in the movie.
Yes. And that definitely that was kind of fascinating, as you can imagine, because it was a woman that actually had an intimate relationship with him. So that was a very interesting perspective, like somebody just telling stories that many times were almost mundane, but the way that their interaction occurred, that, his sort of domineering presence, but he wanted to, in his mind, he was charming. But, I can't, of course, at this point, can't think of a good example, but that sort of thing where he wanted to act like he was this charming, charismatic guy, but he really wasn't. He was just, like any one of these guys, they're basically bullies. They're bullies that have been bullied. And the only people that can get away with bullying themselves is, unfortunately, is women.
What did you think when you first saw the film? I'm assuming you watched it when it came out. What were your initial thoughts about Bundy as a movie?
I thought Matthew did a great job. I think that I think everybody involved did a great job. I think Michael Riley Burke was great. Of course, I can't remember. Is her name Amanda Bodie? Across the board, I think everybody did. Tiffany Shafis is in it, a scene.
I think Tom Savini had a cameo too.
Tom Savini's in it. Yeah. It's always those things where you pass off a script and you hope for the best. And I've been very fortunate in that regard. And in particular, Ted Bundy. I was very happy with how that turned out. And there's even a couple of scenes in it where, like, as written, the way that Matthew sort of realized it on the screen was very gratifying. Like, I don't know if you remember the scene specifically, but there's the one scene where it's after Bundy has been arrested, and they're sitting in the waiting room out of the jail, not the waiting room, but where they could meet and visit with each other. Visiting room, I guess you'd call that. And when the girlfriend's talking to Ted and he sort of tries to do his kind of like put his charm on her. And there's a moment where she just looks at him like it contrary to convincing her that he's innocent, she realizes in that moment, oh my God. I don't know if there's no reason you'd remember that scene specifically, but like as written.
No, I do remember that scene. Yeah.
Okay. like that's one of those things you write into a script and you're like, man, I hope they're able to kind of pull this off. And it is in the movie. It's pulled off perfectly. You understand that in that moment, Ted's trying to lay on his charm, and it's the fact that he's doing it that way because he couldn't be sincere. He was a guy that's incapable of sincerity. And so in that moment, he just convinces her that he is in fact guilty.
One of the most interesting aspects of that movie is the final act, and then I would separate that from the little coda at the end with the "I am Ted Bundy" scene. But
right.
Well, I want to talk about that ending because the execution is really drawn out. It's 12 minutes long, I believe. Did you originally write it to be that long, or was that more of Matthews wanting to draw it out as like a form of
that I have because that's true that he wasn't the one. The executioner was in fact a woman, which
that okay? I was going to ask you about that.
Yeah, I always thought that was perfectly poetic, but the long sequence, that's primarily Matthews doing.
Okay,
as the director.
It's a very cathartic scene, to be honest, because after everything you witness, you really hate this. You really hate Ted Bundy at the end. By the time they're putting the cotton balls up his ass.
Well, and that's also, it's like, again, going back to the idea of people making, casting accusations of glorification. And you kind of want to go, how is that? You're showing that this guy's getting his comeuppance.
What was it like writing that? And then I know you said there were aspects of it that Matthews sort of more leaned into, sort of making it a little bit more drawn out. But how do you go about writing something like the execution scene or the finale? Because like it's harder to do these true crime stories because there isn't necessarily a clear beginning, middle, and end. So how do you craft an ending for one of these movies about a serial killer?
Well, in that case, like I say, the execution that provided its own ending, and then learning and research that it was in fact a woman executioner. Of course, you're like, oh, well, that's perfect. It almost seems like a contrived ending, except that it's real life. Well, of course, you haven't seen Kemper, so I
have to be honest with you. There were people that said to me, there is no way there's no way the executioner was a woman. So I'm glad to find out, no, that wasn't in fact true.
That is true. Yeah.
Some people, I think it's almost like too good to be true.
Well, that's what I mean. It's like it's a contrivance, and I understand. I mean, it seems like it's a contrivance, but except that it's not. It actually, and whether that was done deliberately by the prison or the state or whatever, I don't know. But that kind of provides its own ending in that regard. And the coda at the end that you refer to, that's none of my doing.
Okay.
The I am Ted Bundy. That's not.
What did you think of the I am Ted Bundy scene? Because I have my own thoughts on it, and I feel like it was Matthews sort of taking jabs at our obsession culturally with serial killers. But I know a lot of people that got very upset with that scene, and I think people have misread it a lot.
I agree. Yeah. And in point of fact, the first time I saw the movie and I saw that at the end, I thought, well, that's an odd tone to strike at the end. But
yeah, it's sort of almost like a parody of the Malcolm X scene from
right
Spike Lee's movie Malcolm X. Yeah.
And so if you look at it as a sort of a parody of Malcolm X, one supposes that then you can find it to be somewhat disrespectful. But if you kind of try to appreciate it from more the idea that it was Matthew kind of poking, a hole in our obsession with serial killers, that's my first interpretation. I was not a big fan, but I've kind of come to appreciate it. And I almost.
What was that?
I was going to say that in part of, I think what I've kind of come to appreciate is just how provocative it is to audience members. Just here we are talking about it, that I think anything you can kind of put into a movie that doesn't just immediately drive people away, but if it's provocative in a manner that you find, here it is 20 years later, and we're still kind of debating it.
Well, go on. I'm sorry.
No, just that. I think that's interesting in and of itself. If you can put something in a movie that's provocative, assuming it's not provocative in a way that just turns people off entirely. But, like to me, that's healthy, that it's a provocative scene. And here we are 20 years later, kind of saying, oh, what do you think it meant? I don't know. What do you think it meant?
When you wrote the Bundy movie, was it more written as like, did you want it to be very almost documentary like, docudrama like originally? I guess I want to compare and contrast it to the movie that came out because I like Matthew. I think brought a real. You could tell that Matthew Bright had contempt for the
Mhm.
subject. I mean, he has a lot of contempt for Bundy in this movie, and I was wondering, do you think he added a sort of I guess righteous anger to the movie that wasn't necessarily in the script, or was it in the script?
It wasn't because again, my approach to things is well, specifically the serial killer stuff, is I try to just kind of just what's the old Joe Friday, just the facts, ma'am, kind of thing. So I try to pick the story, the narrative, work all that out, and tell the story as sort of compellingly as I can. Um, and then pass it off to a director to kind of do what they're going to do with it. So Matthew very much, brought his own sensibility to that script. Like for instance, like if I wrote a few years back, I wrote a kids movie, believe it or not, called CIA.
I was going
And
to say CIA. Yes. Yeah.
that script, I was a lot more. I brought a. There's a lot more of me in that script because it was me writing a kids movie. Whereas with the serial killer things, it's kind of more like, okay, I'm laying down the facts. Here's the story. Whereas I guess it depends on the subject matter or my approach. Like I might put a little bit more of me or my personality. I'm not trying to put my personality in a serial killer script.
Now, is there any element, because I talked with Chuck about this too, and Chuck said that he felt there were scenes in the Hillside Strangler that were almost like quasi-comedic, or that you could laugh at something that Angelo or Kenneth said. And there is sort of like dark humor there. Is any dark humor that people see in these movies intentional on your part, or do you think that was more the director's?
Sometimes, well, probably more the director, but there are certain scenes that I think, because as a writer, like when you have really like bleak scenes, you almost want to kind of to reel it in then a little bit. Um, I think it was Stephen King that once like talked about the idea of like in writing stories or his books that giving the audience a little bit back and forth. Um, but also just the fact that like some of those their actions are so kind of bleak and depraved that, to Chuck's point, they almost, it's a weird way to put it, but like they almost become vaguely humorous because
It's so absurd.
Right. Yeah. Like if it's hard to imagine that there are actually human beings behaving this way. And so it becomes vaguely humorous because of the absurdity of it.
Since I'm big on the Ted Bundy movie from 2002, is there anything you're most proud of about that script in particular, or that screenplay?
Gosh, the most, I mean, it sort of applies to all of them, I suppose. It's like I say with Ed Gein, I sort of started on that path, and even though it's all sort of part of that original serial killer trilogy, I did try to give each of them their own personality, like tailored after the killer I was portraying. And so I think specifically, I think Ted Bundy, like overall, that movie does a great job of not just my script, but the performances and Matthew's direction. It does a great job of not just telling the story of Ted Bundy, but truly almost feeling like the character of Ted Bundy, if that's not too opaque.
No,
Like
no, I think I understand what you mean there. I mean, it's a very I think that movie, it feels very singular when it comes to other serial killer movies. It's a very different kettle of fish, if you know what I mean.
Well, it's you're creating a movie, typically if you think of like protagonists in movies, the audience is supposed to perhaps admire or, identify with the protagonist. So it's a very different thing when you're making a movie where you actually want your audience to have utter, revulsion for your protagonist. And that certainly works in Hillside Strangler too. But I think with Ted Bundy, I don't know, there's something about that movie specifically that the audience that as you follow the movie that you just have nothing but scorn for Bundy.
It was funny. I was watching a review of Bundy recently from a YouTuber, and they were like, "I don't understand. This is playing out like a comedy in the first 20 minutes." I was wondering, what do you think about that darkly satirical edge that Matthew Bright brought to it? Because I think it makes the film work for me on like a level that I mean, I place it right next to like Henry Portrait of a Serial Killer as
Oh my
like the
gosh, thank
top.
you.
Yeah.
I don't know
But I feel like it's that.
the corner there. My
Oh, you're
original
showing me it.
Henry.
Oh, I like that.
You see that the original Henry thing?
But what I was going to say is that darkly comedic edge and the sort of it's unique. It's a really unique take on the sort of serial killer subgenre in movies, and it's darkly satirical, and it also just there's that anger towards the subject. It does not glorify. It seeks to actually cut the serial killer down to size, which is something that I like about the movie. And I was wondering how you feel about the darkly comical edge and that aspect that Matthew brought to it, because I think it's very divisive for a lot of people.
No, absolutely. But and I think the thing is that you'd have to be that specific sort of approach works with Bundy because again, going back to like what I was saying about the idea of that, he thought of himself as quite, he had a high opinion of himself.
Well, it's not just him though, right? I mean, he is like the boogeyman, for our culture in a lot of ways.
Sure,
I mean,
sure.
in a way, I think sometimes we almost put people like Bundy on a weird pedestal culturally.
Oh
Which
yeah,
is,
yeah, yeah. It's weird. But that specifically, like that sort of humor, that it's sort of like it's there just enough that it's not doesn't come horribly overt, but it's like
it
as we're watching,
demythologizes Bundy
yeah,
in a lot
yeah,
of ways. Yeah.
that's a good way to put it. It's sort of like we're making as the story progresses, we're not just we're not just horrified by him. We start to actually realize how pathetic, and we're sort of making fun of him. I think that is why it works the way it does. Like, I don't know if you took that same approach with, say, well, even with Hillside Strangler. It's that required a very sort of deft hand, and I think it works with Bundy, and I don't know that it would work. Like, I don't think it would work with Ed Gein. Like that Ed Gein was a pretty straightforward. Like, I don't think that there's a whole lot of humor in there. Does that make sense? Like, I think Bundy as a character.
Well, I think for me, there's such a mythology around Bundy
Right,
that
right,
I don't think that mythology is there for the Hillside Strangler Ed Gein.
right.
So you can do it with Bundy because you can take away the mythic bullshit and turn him into the man he is, which is a very pathetic man.
Because a lot of, yeah, to your point, it's that there's Bundy's sort of a household name, I suppose. Whereas, which is, I think, why you can sort of demythologize him in that manner, because it's sort of like we all, and God, I mean, there was just another Bundy thing recently, right? I've not seen it.
Yeah,
So
I think it was the Joe Berlinger, shockingly, disgustingly evil was something.
something, yeah, yeah. I mean, so even here we are 20 years later, or 20 years after my movie. But we're still making Ted Bundy movies.
Yeah, and that had Zac Efron of all people in.
Zac Efron, right, exactly. Which is again going like you want to go like the guy who actually is good looking and charming playing a guy who was not.
Right.
I
I think Matthew Bright said in an interview, this was not a charming guy. He had a misshapen head.
Well, and again, like going back to how utterly unself-aware he was like when he said something about what a nice guy he was. Like Ted Bundy referring to himself, like saying it's like, that was what he wanted people to understand, that he actually was a really nice guy. And you're like, but you're not, dude. That's not, you can't, you can't have both sides of that equation.
And there's that line in The Execution too, where he says something along the lines of, I know I'm not like other people. I cannot have any connection with other people or sincerity, but I'm still human. Like,
Mm-hmm.
some of the
Right,
dialogue
right.
is very, yeah.
Precisely right. Where it's like, no, that's utterly contrary. Like the two things you just said do not align. And again, his complete lack of self awareness that he would say things that he thought were where you're just like, but no, see, those two things do not go together.
So I'm curious, did the with regards to the screenplay, was the stuff in there? So, like for instance, the beginning of the movie, we see him doing his sort of kleptomania thing, where he's like, I think he was stealing potted plants. Was that how you originally started it out in the screenplay, or?
Yeah, the very much so, because it is an interesting sort of progression. Him and again, that's sort of part of the pathology, that it does start with pushing the envelope, I guess you'd say, of sort of aberrant behavior, like whether it be kleptomania. Of course, a lot of these guys get into like harming animals. Um, and
One
to
of the
Matthew,
most memorable scenes in the movie that gets into what you're talking about is the escalation aspect. Is before he does the killings, he's like peeping in a woman's window, and the some guy comes out and says, "Not you again." And he throws water on Ted Bundy.
uh-huh,
They're
uh-huh.
like, but you see the escalation. He goes from peeping Tom to like, I'm gonna beat a woman with a stick on the side of the road. Yeah.
And the and even like that aspect of like going back to like the patheticness of his, he's standing outside of a woman masturbating. It's standing outside of a woman's window masturbating, and
I forgot to mention that part. Yeah, he is jerking the McGurkin.
yes, precisely. And that was so far as again, a lot of the pathology for all of these guys follows a similar pattern, but I think Bundy's was specific in the sense that he started. And of course, there's the whole bizarre aspect of his childhood, like learning that the woman he thought was his mother was actually his sister, or whatever the case. Remember, I forget now. um, the but that he started like very low, just as a kleptomaniac, a peeping Tom, masturbating outside women's windows, and then he wound up committing some of the most horrific acts that almost seem physically impossible. Kidnapping and murdering two women at once. Like you almost wonder, like that doesn't even seem like that would be physically possible.
Yeah, it's very interesting. So that was there even in your original screenplay, that's sort of starting with the small things and then going on, he escalates into murder.
Yeah,
Yeah.
very much so. Yeah.
Okay.
And like I say,
That's
that's the way that I would approach these. Well, I guess I still do, but that doing the research so that I could see what the main beats were going to be, because obviously they're real life stories, so they kind of dictate to me how I'm going to have to tell the story. And that was the thing that kind of right away I realized it's like, oh, I mean, it's not a slow progression because it happened quickly, but he started on this very almost mundane level. There's plenty of kleptomaniacs in the world who don't go on to harm people. But his specific pathology, it started that way, and then it ended, as horrifically as it did.
That leads me into another aspect. There is sort of a buildup in Bundy and in even Ed Gein and the Hillside Strangler, where you're showing you actually make us get to know the characters before we get into the sort of murder and mayhem. Do you think that sets it apart from other serial killer movies? I mean, the serial killer movies you've written and worked on, I feel like they don't easily fit into either pure docudrama or like I wouldn't call them exploitation movies either. And I was wondering if you could like talk about that, because I think it walks a fine line um, between those two worlds. I know people that love exploitation movies that do watch Ed Gein or Ted Bundy and enjoy them. But I don't think they're pure exploitation. I don't think they're pure docudrama. And I really want to emphasize that, because I don't like the way, and I've talked with Chuck about this, I don't like the idea that these movies that you've worked on would get labeled as exploitation movies. But go on.
Well, I think it kind of goes back to
Sorry for being long-winded, by the way.
no, please. It's when I wrote the original Ed Gein script, part of what drove me to that was that I was introduced to the character of Ed Gein from these various other movies. And so when I was just like, well, gosh, if he's inspired these movies, I should study his story and maybe write his movie. And that sort of led me into humanizing him. Maybe that's the difference when people talk about glorifying, and I would just use the word humanizing, and that they're and telling the story as honestly as possible. And to me, the only thing that makes that kind of thing really work is that you show that they might be despicable characters, but that they are actually characters. And, as opposed to Friday the 13th and Jason or something, this just unstoppable killer, which I love those movies too. But, they're two very different animals, even though you're just dealing with somebody who is a killer. I guess you could make those movies, and again, it's like exploitative that to the degree that people would make that accusation, but it's the story. It's the story that's as it occurred, which I guess is why I find that kind of thing fascinating. It's just fascinating to me that we live in a world where these guys operate. As we're having this conversation, there are serial killers out there, perhaps in our neighborhoods, doing horrible, horrible things. And, they're somehow able to navigate their personal lives and yet commit these atrocities.
And maybe a better way to put it is, I do think, they're commercial movies. They're meant for public consumption. In that sense, they are exploiting an interest that all of us have in serial killers. However, one thing I wanted to delve into was, I think you do show a respect for the victims in these movies that we wouldn't get out of, say, Friday the 13th. Do you want to speak to that? Like, what role do the victims play in your screenplays?
Well, I do. I've certainly tried to, present the victims as actual. It's a hard sort of a thing to do because you're going to have let's face it, if the person's a victim and they're only going to be on screen for 5 or 10 minutes, it's kind of hard to really give them character and humanize them, but you sort of try the best you can. And I always did, like, I remember in Hillside Strangler, there's one character who gets killed in her apartment. And the way I wrote it in the script is I just described her coming home from work, feeding her cat. Like, it was the most like 3 pages of script that was just her doing the most mundane stuff. But that hopefully then made it, when she's suddenly attacked, drove home the point that this is just some poor woman going about her day, and the monster intrudes on her life. So I'm sure that those 3 pages of screenplay were probably extraordinarily boring to read, but it was, like in a movie, if you're watching 3 minutes and basically nothing's happening, you might be like, well, this is getting boring. Nothing's happening. And you're just like, right.
The one I was thinking of was the bartender woman from Ed Gein.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
I thought she was portrayed as a very human sort of character. It wasn't a caricature,
Mm-hmm. Well, in Ed Gein, of course, since you just had the Bernice Worden character that he murdered and the bartender character that he murdered.
But was Bernice the one that worked at the
store?
Was it the store?
Store.
Yeah.
So in that case, it was sort of like you had more time to spend with those characters, you try to be at least cognizant of the fact that you are dealing with real, people.
They're very different, I guess, to me, those characters were very different than the type of characters we would see in, like, a Friday the 13th movie.
Right. Right. Well, because and again, like I keep feeling the need to somehow make it clear that I love these various movies too. But let's face it, some of what makes those movies kind of work is that that it's cannon fodder. Like that's actually the thing you're going in sort of for. So whereas since I'm dealing with like real former human beings and I don't want to denigrate their memory. I want to take whatever amount of time I have available to me to try to make them as real as I can, so that you are sympathetic when they're killed. Whereas I think some of the conceit when you're watching like a Friday the 13th film is that you kind of know that they're not real people. That's kind of what makes some of the fun of them.
Do you think there's also a difference in the approach? You know, a Friday the 13th movie is a carnage candy movie, as I would call it. I think what you're doing with the Hillside
Carnage
Strangler, Ed
candy.
Gein, Ted Bundy, I think you're almost trying to get us into their psychology, which is a very different thing than what Friday the 13th is doing. Would you agree with that? Or
Yeah, very much so. Yeah, yeah. I would say that when I set out to write like a serial killer movie, I want it to be disturbing. Whereas I don't think people make Friday the 13th movies because they want them to be scary. And those are two very different motivations, to be disturbing versus being scary. You mentioned Henry Portrait of a Serial Killer. That's always been one of my favorite all-time movies. And I saw that when it originally played at the Biograph Theater in Chicago. And so that was very much top of my head when I was writing Ed Gein way back then, because that's probably, and even to this day, I would say Henry's probably the most like unrelentingly disturbing movie that's ever been made.
what was it about Henry that disturbed you? I'm just curious.
I think
Like,
just
if you
the
could put
way
it into words. Yeah.
that because it's the way that John McNaughton played the material. I mean, beyond the fact that the cast is fantastic, but it's like John McNaughton went into that knowing he wasn't going to give you a chance to like catch your breath. Like that movie just keeps getting more and more and more and more intense until the ending, and then you fade to black, and I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought there.
The thing that I was going to say with Henry, the thing that gets me is Michael Rooker basically plays Henry is almost like a metaphysical void. Like there's no humanity there. There's no, I mean, everything he does is wearing a mask.
Yeah. From the start of him being like an exterminator going into people's houses, and the scene like when he starts dancing with Becky, and it's like the most truncated kind of like he's pretending. It's not even like he's dancing badly. It's like he's pretending to dance. If that makes
Right.
sense, like as a distinction, he's not dancing badly. He's not even dancing. He's pretending to dance.
Yeah, I also Tracy Arnold. I don't think gets enough credit for that movie because in a lot of ways, I think Becky is like she's like an anchor for the movie, and the ending is so much more disturbing because of that.
Because of
You
that,
know,
yeah, absolutely.
and I don't think we ever see. I think there may be one point where we see a cop car pass by in that whole movie, but there's no like it takes place in a world that is invisible to like middle class suburbanite sensibilities. It takes place in this unseen underbelly, and we don't see the cops. We don't see there is no police procedural. That's for me what makes it so frightening.
Yeah, yeah, no, it's a good point. Like when I say that, how disturbing or unremittingly bleak it is. I think that's part of it. Is that like there's at no point in that movie do you even really think that there's going to be a savior or that there's going to be a happy ending, or you just kind of know as that movie progresses. It's like this is going no place good. Whereas at least in my movies, that they end with the guy, the killer getting caught.
How did you first see Henry, by the way? Because I know for years it wasn't available.
It was played at the Music Box Theater in Chicago when I was in Chicago going to school.
Oh, really?
That is an original flyer that was there was a stack of flyers at my school, and I picked it up and I was like, Henry, what is this? And so I saw it at a midnight show at the Music Box Theater and was just, blown away. And I saw the two buddies of mine, and like as we were walking away, it was one of those things like normally if you go to a movie and you walk out and you and your buddies are just talking about it, like we just left the theater like silently, just like, man, I don't know, what do you think? I don't know, man, what do you think? Which I'm saying that is the best thing in the world, that we weren't raving about the movie we just saw. We were like stunned.
I wanted to ask, how do you see your movies in relation to a movie like Henry? And I ask that because it sounds like you're a big fan of Henry. And I know Matthew Bright, at least in his public interviews, was a little bit more critical. He said, I don't really like Henry. because I view it as like emotionally manipulative. And what I was doing with Ted Bundy was more about deconstructing the serial killer mythology. It sounds like your view may differ a bit from Matthew, but do you see any differences between your movie and Henry?
Well, I
Or
guess
your movies and Henry is, yeah.
yeah, I guess again in the sense that although Henry is based very loosely on Henry Lee Lucas, it's certainly a fictionalized version of that story. But it's just in general, it's just, I'm not saying that there are great moments of hope in any of the things I've written, but I don't think they're just overall tonally as bleak. And not just from the direction, but from the way the story's told. And I think part of that is again the fact that there is some acknowledgement that in my movies, the bad guy is going to get some form of comeuppance. Whereas in Henry, I mean, I hate if I'm giving spoilers here if anybody hasn't seen it, but there is no comeuppance in Henry. It ends with him throwing the suitcase with Becky into the marsh, getting in his car and driving away.
I don't know if you want to add anything else about the previous serial killer movies you did, but I wanted to get into your two most recent movies if we could.
Sure.
So in 2023, this movie comes out called The Quantum Devil, and it's made by a friend of the show, Zeph Daniel, who very interesting person. He helped write the movie Society, the great Brian Yuzna movie, and I believe The Quantum Devil is sort of a sequel to a previous movie that he worked on with Larry.
Vaguely.
Well, okay, What exactly is The Quantum Devil?
Now, well, here's the thing. I didn't really work on that. What I did was, oddly enough, Mike Mescal.
Girl Next was the movie I was thinking of. So there's Girl Next and then Quantum Devil, which it's not exactly a sequel, but there's overlaps.
Yeah, it's sort of a thematic sequel or something.
Yes, that's I think Zeph would agree.
And Mike Mescal, who was the co-producer of the serial killer trilogy we've been talking about in depth, years later, he approached me about, I think basically he just wanted a script that could be done in like one location, minimal cast, one location, something that could be done very low budget. And I wrote The Devil's Domain that kind of then Hell's Domain morphed into Devil's Domain, which was sort of about like people in this house and they're being evil online. And then Mike, because Mike's known Zeph for ages, basically Zeph bought that script and used it as inspiration for Quantum Devil. So that's why, like, Mike and I think we both get like inspired by a screenplay by or credit in the movie.
Okay.
Something like, this inspired by a story by, I don't think or maybe it's even story credit. I don't think it's story credit though. I think it's more like inspired by a story by. So in other words, unfortunately, there's not much I can really talk about Quantum Devil because I really had nothing to do with that movie.
Okay. Yeah, I was wondering because it is kind of a maybe departure from your true crime work. But it did make me want to ask a question. When it comes to these true crime stories, there's a recurring interest in human depravity, sort of fractured psyches, even like the serial killers living in an altered state compared to us.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think draws you to these themes?
Well, again, my love of horror, I suppose, and again, part of the whole thing is that going back to the idea that it is it's a business, and so when you sort of find a niche, I mean, I know that like actors always complain about being typecast, which I can appreciate, but my response to that's like, well, if you're being typecast, that probably means you're still working. So
you're making money, you're making a living,
right? So that's sort of like my approach to like part of.
I think you have like maybe a working class mentality towards it, where it's a job. I got to do my job. Got to bring home the bacon.
Yeah, and it's a job I can do. And that, like, if I approach potential investors or producers, and I say, "Hey, I got this great idea for a movie," if I hit them up with like a romantic comedy, they're probably going to look at me like, "Why? What? You want to do what now?" Whereas if I go like, "Here's my latest serial killer movie," they go, "Oh, okay, cool." Which sounds horribly cynical, but I mean, it just
You know
is
what?
what.
I respect that though, because you're giving a more honest answer than most people, where I will have people tell me up and down if it's a public conversation, oh, it's all about the art. And then behind closed doors, they'll say to me, well, it's also a job. I mean, I think we all have artistic aspirations, but I mean, there is, when it comes to movies, especially, there
Yeah,
is
especially right.
a financial aspect to it. It's work.
Yeah, you have to have money. Like well, I mean, if I sit down to write something, it doesn't cost anything. But let's face it, putting a movie on screen costs a significant amount of money. So, um, but like I say, I've always just loved horror and the genre, and I'm just drawn to that kind of darker uh, uh thing. And in for me personally, it's just sort of taken more the form of like damaged human beings, or the Frankenstein monster, but in human form.
That's sort of a lead into the next question I had for you. So you said you didn't work that much on Quantum Devil. It may have been inspired by a story you wrote, but there's not much beyond that. But I did want to ask, since Quantum Devil sort of deals with evil as a metaphysical force, that's very different from the sort of serial killer movies.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Do you view evil? I mean, this is kind of a philosophical question. Do you think the idea of evil is, do you think of evil as a metaphysical force, or do you see it as more like sociological or psychological
Well, I
phenomena?
suppose the dry answer is I see it kind of fully based upon human behavior. That it's entirely pathological or psychological. That's the dry sort of answer. But I love the metaphysical concept. Like uh, uh, John Carpenter's Prince of Darkness or Quantum Devil, or that getting into the idea of like evil being something that is beyond not necessarily the Christian definition of evil or something, but like I do like the idea of it being this kind of quantifiable thing. But if you get into like quantum mechanics and again, like I think the reason that John Carpenter's Prince of Darkness did not do is become more of a cult hit and perhaps didn't do as well, is it was just way ahead of its time.
Yeah, it is interesting because I feel like people, Prince of Darkness was overlooked for many years.
Absolutely. And part of that is because it wasn't easily shoehorned into, well, what's it about? I'm like, well, that's the thing. You kind of have to just be sort of willing to go with it.
Prince of Darkness and what's the other one in the Apocalypse trilogy? The Thing, Prince of Darkness, and the other one is In the Mouth of Madness.
Mouth of Madness, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
And I would like to yeah, anyway, like I've it's all still kind of, I guess, toying with the darkness or the evil that men do. And perhaps it's sort of like, well, what's the origin of the evil that men do? I just think it's kind of that's fun to sort of toy with.
When you're writing dialogue, especially for characters that are like manipulative or just straight up psychopathic, how do you approach writing that dialogue?
Well, a lot of it, I think, is some of the people I've known in my life. Like, after 30 years in Hollywood, you meet some pretty manipulative people. So some of the, not that I'm going to reveal any names, but I mean, some of the dialogue that has been in some of my movies is directly based upon people that I'm personally familiar with.
Whoa.
Just that, and again, I mean, when I was in college, in addition to studying film, I studied psychology because I figured one would sort of inform the other. And I do just find it kind of a fascinating what the human mind is capable of, or more specifically, the lack of self-awareness. And so that I always wanted to make the dialogue as sort of close to real as I could. Um, and so not infrequently, not necessarily say Ted Bundy, but a lot of the dialogue is sort of based upon people I know or have known personally.
Is that where a lot of dialogue? Because I've always had trouble, even when I took like a film writing class, I would always have trouble with dialogue. And people think it's easy, but it can be very difficult. You can end up writing very stilted dialogue if you're not like it's a process you have to learn, writing good, realistic dialogue.
I think dialogue is the hardest aspect, really, of writing a good cohesive script. I mean, beyond mechanics and structure and that, dialogue is very difficult, and especially because a lot of times people make the mistake of they want to tell the story with the dialogue, and that's not the way real dialogue works. Real dialogue is you just communicating, I'm going to go to the store and buy a 6-pack of beer. Like, it's not. I love Quentin Tarantino, but like some of his flowery dialogue, is entertaining as it is, like that's not exactly how real life works. So
I was gonna say that was my biggest problem with I don't know if you're a fan of the Halloween movies, but I really was annoyed with that last one, Halloween Ends. I mean, I think it was well made, but there's like, they constantly make references in the dialogue to like, oh, this town is infected with evil, or they keep using infection as a metaphor. And like, I would understand the metaphor if you show it to me. You don't have to like use it in the dialogue every 5 seconds.
Yeah. No, like I mentioned that I used to mentor students through a screenwriting program, and that would almost inevitably be my number one thing. I'd be like, stop having your characters tell us what's happening. You need to show us what's happening. You can have your characters comment on what's happening, but like that.
Yeah. And for me, it's like you also don't want to have the characters telling you what to think about the movie or telling you what the themes of the movie are. Like, you want the person watching to get there on their own. You don't want to beat them over the head.
Yeah, especially in that, like, I'm going to tell you what the metaphor is. It's like, no, you've lost if you're telling your audience what the metaphor is.
What are the challenges of writing horror that's meant to be both? And maybe you don't think that your movies are meant to be both, but I would assume you want your movies to be both, create a visceral reaction as well as having like an intellectual reaction, maybe.
Oh yeah, very much so. I was saying how that the Kemper has thus far gotten very good press, and the closest thing to sort of negative comments that we've received was sort of the nature of like it being, it's overly disturbing. I want to try to write smart scripts. What the heck? Sorry about that. I want to write smart scripts that tell stories intelligently, but at the end of the day, I do also kind of want to have that visceral response from the audience because, hold on one sec. What's wrong, Little? My dog's freaking out. It's okay. I lost my train of thought there.
You were saying you want people to have that visceral reaction, but you also want them to maybe think about it or to be disturbed by it, or to, there's an intellectual aspect too, because, or again, intellectual reaction.
Because it is dealing with the psychology of psychopaths, and which is inherently disturbing, and you even still encounter that today, where people it'll be discovered that like a neighbor that's been living on a block is a serial killer, and people will say like, well, he always seemed so normal. And you kind of my whole point's sort of trying to illustrate, it's just like, well, they are normal in terms of they're not Michael Myers walking down the street with a rubber mask on. They are in fact normal, except for their pathology, the horrible things they do. So I think it's setting that up, and that delivering on the revealing how disturbing that kind of is.
Do you think that's what makes it so disturbing to people? The topic is that ultimately these serial killers, I mean, they aren't Michael Myers, they aren't Freddy Krueger, they're not Jason Voorhees. They're people that on the day-to-day basis kind of just blend in. You know, you
Right,
will
right.
see them at a grocery store and you wouldn't know, oh, that's a serial killer. Yeah.
Well, I think that that's kind of why some people are as resistant to the movies or the subject matter as they are, is that they don't really, you know, they understand subconsciously that yes, there are serial killers amongst us, but they don't really want to focus on that too much because it is kind of a terrifying concept. I was a friend of mine recently was saying how she years ago had like uh, uh, knew on some level knew a guy that then later on she learned was in fact a serial killer. So, like that's inherently disturbing to realize that you knew a guy and, by extension, potentially might have become a victim.
One thing I wanted to ask you about, and I do want to get to the Kemper movie. I know we've run a little bit long, like an hour and 15 here, but I did want to ask, I think sometimes when we watch, say, a documentary on, like, I think it's called ID or Identity Discovery, or even like a Lifetime movie based on a serial killer, there's a lot of serial killer media out there that I think can get into sensationalism and even sort of fostering moral panic ideas, like oh, we have to be afraid of just walking outside because there could be a serial killer. I feel like your films and the films of Chuck Parello, you don't engage in that kind of moral panic about serial killers. You're just telling these specific stories. Do you think that's conscious on your part not to lean into the moral panic aspect of a lot of this true crime media we see out there?
Yeah, I don't know how conscious that is as a decision is. I mean,
am I misreading you? Do you think there is like a moral panic that
no,
we
no, no,
should
no,
have about this?
but it is. I know what you're referring to. That I do on some level find almost amusing. That some of that sort of like, oh my, don't leave your house and beware of everyone. And you're like, well, no, you don't really need to take it quite that far. But that it's sort of, there's going to be a really horrible analogy, but it's sort of like something like Jaws, where chances are real good if you jump in the ocean, you're not going to get attacked by a shark. But that doesn't mean that the shark's not out there. I don't know if that answers your question at all, but
No, I totally get it.
but like to your point about, I actually wrote a Lifetime movie once upon a time.
You know what? I'll be honest. I'm a closet fan of Lifetime movies.
It's funny. A lot of people are, but it's its own kind of weird formula, and especially like the ones that deal with serial killers. Like it's almost like it's its own genre, like the Lifetime serial killer movie.
Yeah, I think that's true of Lifetime movies. And I have to be honest, Lifetime movies to me are sort of, I think Joe Bob Briggs has said this before, that they're sort of like the modern drive-in movies, because they are deeply sensationalistic movies.
Absolutely, yeah,
that hit
yeah.
all the beats. But what are you allowed to talk about? What Lifetime movie did you work on?
Oh, it was a script that I wrote years ago called Officer Down.
Oh, this is the one with Sherilyn Fenn.
With Sherilyn Fenn, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, that was some time ago. So it wasn't really a Lifetime movie. It was a movie that was made.
It was a TV movie, though, right? Yeah.
Sold to Lifetime, so it wasn't really truly a Lifetime movie, but it did air on Lifetime, which was kind of its own weird little, thrill for me. I like the fact that I've written serial killer movies, a kids movie, a Lifetime movie.
Are there any genres or stories you haven't tackled yet that you want to?
I mean, I wouldn't say yes, but I can't think of one off the top of my head, just because anything's a challenge. The kids movie that I wrote, I was approached by somebody I've known for forever. In fact, it was the guy, one of the folks who put me in touch with Hamish McAlpine for the Ed Gein project way back in the day. And he had an opportunity to make a kids movie, and he just needed kind of a script sort of tailored to his situation, and asked me if I'd be interested in doing it. And I just took it as a challenge. I was like, yeah, actually, that'd be fun. And there was something kind of freeing about, writing something that was the polar opposite of like that kind of usual dark material.
I was gonna say, do you ever have to like take a break from it? What I mean is like, I mean, you're literally immersing yourself in the world of these killers when you're writing the screenplays. Do you ever have to like shut off and be like, I need to do something else right now. I need to relax.
Yeah, yes and no. I mean, yes, in the sense that it's like it can get like really sort of bleak, but sort of my process is, it tends to be to submerge myself and just take it there. And then when I'm done with the script after, 8 weeks, then I emerge into sunlight and just then walk away entirely for a couple of months.
How do you go about immersing yourself in well, let's do this. I want to talk about Kemper. So how do you immerse yourself in the psyche of someone like an Edmund Kemper?
Again, it's just doing as much research finding as much research as I can. And, it's also become a little bit easier over the years because I've now done it a few times. But again, like understanding the psychology, I took pathology courses like in college and psychology.
So you took pathology. That's why. Yeah.
Not that I approached a degree in psychology or anything of that nature, but
you took courses on it. I was going to say, I can tell that you took courses on it based on what I've seen from your movies.
Right. So, and it's just sort of taking yourself to I was going to say watching nothing but horror movies, but of course that's typically what I do anyway. But you just put on like the death metal and it just sort of let it sort of take over.
What death metal do you listen to when you're writing a screenplay?
Cannibal Corpse or, of course, now I can't off the top of my head. I mean, these my CD collections of,
wow,
Merciful Fate, which is not death metal, but Dark Angel, Death Angel, Obituary.
I'm a Morbid Angel guy.
Okay, Morbid Angel.
I'm in Florida right now, so they represent over here.
You're in Florida. Where are you? Are you near Tampa?
Yes, yeah.
Okay, yeah, I know that's like the Tampa area is sort of known as the death metal capital of the country. Yeah. Well,
I could see how death metal would be good for writing these, though. Sort of immerses you in this sort of transgressive realm.
Right. It just puts you into the wrong or right headspace, I guess. In this case, the right headspace.
The wrong headspace normally, but the right headspace in this case. All right.
Right. And just sort of, again, just letting yourself go someplace that most of the time you might not want to go, but it tends to be conducive to the material. Sort of like method acting, I suppose. Method writing.
So I was going to ask, Kemper, this is a collaboration between yourself and director Chad Farron. Chad's been working sort of in the low-budget horror world for years now. He's worked in every genre, when it comes to horror. So he's done everything from serial killer horror to Lovecraftian horror. Very interesting guy, and one day I'm going to have to try to get him on this show. But how did the Kemper movie come about? I really want to promote this since it's brand new.
It's it's a script that I wrote quite some time ago, and Mike Mescal, his name keeps coming up. But this was like 25 years ago. After we had the initial success with the serial killer movies, he approached me about, and it might have even been his idea to do Kemper. I don't really remember, but he approached me about doing another sort of a balls to the wall one, shall we say. And part of the reason why we decided on the Ed Kemper story is his story itself is pretty intense. I don't know how familiar or if you are at all with the Ed Kemper story.
I'm familiar with it, yeah.
But I don't want to necessarily give away the story itself. But the one thing and in fact, I'm even kind of going through this now, because Kemper has proven to be pretty successful, trying to find yet again another serial killer character. But it becomes increasingly difficult to find serial killer stories that are inherently interesting, or at least a new take on a serial killer story.
Right. We should mention too, for people that don't know, Kemper was called the co-ed killer.
The co-ed killer, yes.
But you were saying it's difficult finding.
Well, trying to find ones that I feel like I can bring some sense of originality, or that it a new approach to the material. Whereas Kemper just sort of provided that, because he's an inherently kind of interesting character, because he actually is a bright guy as opposed to most.
Yeah, he's like very smart, and like he's a very strangely introspective person. I've seen documentaries where he talks about, serial killing, and he was in one documentary called, I think, Death Street USA, where he's like literally saying these are the signs, and if you are feeling these things, you should seek help immediately. He's very introspective about what he did, and there's almost like a regret to it. He's a very unusual character in the serial killer sort of world.
Precisely. And he actually is like that kind of the rare, smart, above average intelligence, very introspective, very honest. Precisely that. Most of these guys, to the degree that they'll even admit anything, they'll tell it in such a way as that, like, I wasn't that bad, or like Bundy with his comment about, that he was actually a really nice guy. Kemper is upfront. He'll tell you exactly what he did, why he did it, to the degree he understands why he did it, but and exactly that. Like, so that just made that inherently fascinating. But his story itself is just genuinely horrific and brutal. And so that was a script that I had written quite some time ago. And then Mike, he's actually known Chad for years, but he recently reestablished contact, recently as in the last couple of years, reestablished contact with Chad and asked him, it's like, hey, because Chad had just done Pig Killer, which is the Picton true crime thing. And Mike asked him if he would be interested in reading another serial killer script. And Chad said, sure, send it on over. And that was the Kemper script. And Chad read it, liked it a lot. And just about that quickly, we were up and running.
What for you makes Kemper interesting? Because I was sort of waxing with my own opinions there. What's the big thing that stands out for you? Is this also the first time you've done a serial killer movie where the serial killer is still technically alive?
Yes. And in fact, I've even got like it was kind of facetious, but I talked to Chad about the idea of doing a sort of a God forbid, self-reflexive kind of Scream kind of a movie, where people make a movie about a living serial killer, and the serial killer breaks out of prison to come after them. But yes, that, which is its own kind of weird dynamic, because one assumes at some point I don't know, maybe Kemper will have absolutely no interest in seeing it, but I would think if a movie came out and it was actually your story, you'd be interested in seeing it.
Kemper too, didn't he turn himself in, right?
Yeah. So that's why I said I don't want to give necessarily.
I don't want to give it away, but what stands out to me about him is after a certain, I would just say this: he had mommy issues, and after the mommy issues were dealt with, it's almost like his rage dissipated in a weird way.
Yeah, exactly. Which again is another thing that made it fascinating. It was like precisely that. That's a good way to put it. I think is that he when the origins of his mommy issue, when they were dealt with or resolved, his anger basically dissipated, and he was done.
Now I want to ask, who played Kemper in this?
Brandon Kirk.
Okay.
He does a phenomenal job. The whole cast, it's one of those rare occasions where everything across the board just fell into place.
Now you do have some, I asked because you do have some recognizable names in this, at least if you're a horror movie fan. I think Brink Stevens has an appearance in it, and Lou Temple is in it too, right? Who does Lou play in it?
He's got a very small part.
Okay.
He just plays Kemper's father.
Oh, okay. That's that may be a small part, but that's an interesting part to have.
And Brink Stevens, her character that's in it is she's friends with Kemper's mom. And again, it's a larger part than that, but it's still a small part. But it's a very kind of a significant role. It's a small role, but it's kind of a significant one.
Okay. Anything else you want to say about Kemper, or what do you want to say about Chad? Because I feel like Chad's a director that's been overlooked in a lot of ways, and I'd like to see more people become aware of him.
Yeah, absolutely. And I feel safe in saying that we will work together again. And in fact, I've had some conversations about different things. And hopefully a project that I'm trying to put together, I think he'd be perfect for. What I specifically liked about his approach to the Kemper material is that he appreciated and when you see the movie, you'll see it's a little bit more overt, perhaps, than the previous serial killer movies. But the approach to the material is that it's a horror movie, that it's a true crime serial killer movie. But yeah, and of course, Chad being Chad, he embraced that from the get go, which you'll sort of appreciate a bit more what I mean when you've seen the movie. But I just like that. I like that he was approaching it first and foremost as a horror movie in the same way that I wrote the script way back when.
Oh, okay. So has that been a thing with you in the past where maybe you lean into horror more than the directors did in past projects?
Somewhat, yeah. Yeah. Like my original script for Ed Gein was far more like gothic, almost ghost. Like his mother is there are scenes in the original script where like his mother appears like more in ghostly form, not literally as a ghost, but it's more like he was not just haunted psychologically, but you get the idea that he was physically haunted by the spirit of his mother. Not to say that she was a literal ghost, but just things of that, which is in no way to say that I'm dissatisfied with the movie as it came out. It's just that I always approached the material a little bit more overtly like I was writing a horror film, and for varying reasons, that's sometimes not what the producers want.
Yeah, well, when did you write the Ed Gein screenplay?
That would have been
like
the
ballpark time period, but
early 90s. I mean,
that's what I was going to say is, so the movie comes out, I think, in the late 90s or early 2000s.
I think it was literally 2000.
Right. And at that time, horror was kind of out in some ways, unless you were doing like the meta parody, like the Scream type stuff,
Right. So whereas now you can actually tell people you want to make a horror film, and they're far more receptive to it. During those days, it was sort of more like, no, that's not what we're
going to do the docudrama thing.
Right, precisely. And I'm trying to think. Yeah, anyway. Yeah, very much so. Whereas I mean, there's always kind of been an ebb and flow to horror, but it seems interesting that it's now, because like back in the day when they would like if you referred to something as a horror film, like producers would be like, well, it's more of a psychological drama, or well, okay. Like you're gonna get caught up in sort of like what actual genre title you're gonna give it. Anyway, it's heartening that horror has proven itself to have the longevity that it does, which is why like working with somebody like Chad is, it's been a great experience, because he fully embraces the idea that we're making a horror movie.
Yeah, I think Chad's also a director that really knows how to make he knows how to make the most out of often very limited budgets.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, it's funny that you say that. I just watched the movie again with my wife a couple of nights ago, and instant messaged him basically saying like, man, like, because when the whole thing first came up a couple of years ago, or even it hasn't even been a couple of years, but initially I was somewhat skeptical at the idea. It's like, really, you're gonna make this movie and you're gonna shoot it in 10 days with $100,000, like I was like, okay. But then I kind of realized from his other movies, I was like, well, if anybody can do it, it's certainly you. And of course, then he did. And
what other movies of his did you watch out of curiosity?
Oh, shoot, I watched a couple.
I know the big one he did was called like Unspeakable.
He
did another one called The Goals, but those are like early for him. He's done a lot since then. Yeah.
But it's always that interesting thing where he's because I've certainly like encountered filmmakers that are at the other end of the spectrum where it's sort of like they have too much money and their vision is small. Whereas it's like Chad somehow has doesn't need money to realize his vision. If that makes sense.
Yeah, he did another serial killer movie a few years ago. It wasn't based on anything true story-wise, but he did a movie called Night Caller. It was pretty interesting because it was Steve Railsback as like an Ed Gein type killer. He's just very good at this genre work.
Oh, Pig Killer, right? The Picton thing.
No, I was thinking of one called Night Killer. I haven't seen the Picton
Night
one.
Killer. Oh, I
Pig
see.
Killer, I think, was the one he did immediately after Night Caller.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Wow, Chad, he's even done more movies than I realized.
I mean, he's done a ridiculous amount of movies.
It is. Yeah, it's amazing. Well, here's hoping he continues to do so.
Just two or three more questions if you have the time, and they can be brief.
Sure.
How do you feel when you watch the final cut of the film you've written? Do you see it as your story, or has it transformed into something else in a collaborative sort of way?
For the most part, like I've been very fortunate in the sense I haven't really had. I certainly know guys that have had very bad experiences in, I've had a couple of not great experiences, but they were kind of on a small scale. So I can't really complain too much because it didn't really matter all that much to me. But in terms of scripts that I've written that either were original to me, I've been very fortunate, the movies that come out, even sometimes there might be changes. Like I was saying with Ed Gein, the movie as I originally envisioned it was a tonally different than what exists now. But that's not to say that I have any real complaints about the movie that exists now.
Well, even when we were talking about Bundy, it's like there were even aspects added on, like the I am Ted Bundy scene. But it sounds like, in some ways, some of those additions can be good, or, they work for the time period, et cetera, et cetera.
Absolutely. And again, it's people are, anybody that gets into this trade or takes on this craft, if you're not fully aware that you're going to pass off the baton and then changes are going to be made, like inevitably there's changes will be made. Well, and
you just sort of have to you have to accept that in a way.
Precisely. And there's been a couple of, like, there's one thing specifically which I won't mention by title because it's completely misbegotten, but it was a script that I wrote several years ago that was bought by a producer, and another guy came in to rewrite it, and it's basically now it exists as a negligible piece of crap. But so that wasn't a good experience. But then again, it's okay because my batting average is still pretty good. And then that's something like Kemper that comes along, which has been nothing but a great experience.
Now, where can my folks listening to this in the audio version, or I'm going to post a video version as well, where can they get a hold of Kemper? How can they watch it?
I think as of right now, it's on VOD and it's pretty much available wherever it's on Prime Video, it's on iTunes, it's out there. I think it's fairly easily findable. And there will be a forthcoming director's cut, DVD, Blu-ray.
Oh, so there is going to be physical media.
Absolutely.
Awesome.
That's one of those things that Chad and I are both very well, he's got a bit more power in making it happen than I as a lowly writer do, but we're very much still in the whole, hard media. Well, I got my Blu-rays and I like to have them on my shelf, the physical representation.
So looking back, and this may be a difficult question, which project are you most proud of, and which one would you want another shot at if you could have another shot at it?
Well, even though it just came out, but I think I'm sort of, I guess I'll kind of have to say, sorry, I'll make an answer here. I'm sort of most proud of Ed Gein because that was my first sort of significant movie that came out that was my original script. I sold, handed it off, got made well with Steve Railsback, Carrie Snodgress. I had written, like some low budget erotic thrillers or like a Playboy movie prior to that, which while I was proud because I was getting, hired and paid to write things, Ed Gein's probably my first one that I was proud, oh, this is my movie. But I think, I could kind of honestly say that in terms of movies I'm sort of most proud of is like Temper, because it just feels fully realized. And even though it's the one that just came out, and so I'm kind of still, writing the coattails of that, but it really kind of has reinvigorated me in a way.
Is there any you would want another shot at if you were to cover a serial killer? Yeah.
I think I would probably say, well, I think any artist would probably say that about like anything they've done, maybe.
Yeah.
But
we're not necessarily even attacking the previous efforts, but is there one that you did before, like a Hillside Strangler and Ed Gein, that you would want to do again?
I think probably maybe the Starkweather one, simply because it was done with like very low budget. And
I was going to say, I thought it was interesting. You mentioned you kept saying the trilogy, and I'm like, well, what about the quadrilogy with Starkweather?
I just, because the what I refer to as the trilogy, that's the one that was like with Hamish McAlpine and Mike Mescal, that specific trilogy, whereas Starkweather was something completely separate. And although I'm proud of that movie as it came out, it was sort of one of those things where I sold that script, and it was, I think the movie as it exists is actually quite good, but it's it's quite good in spite of a lot of things. Whereas I think if you had basically more money to put behind it, it's a bit bigger in scope. Whereas the movie that was made from it is very small, and I don't mean small in a critical way, but I just feel like another at bat with that movie, perhaps with a bigger budget.
It's kind of a hard story to tell, Carol Ann Fugate and Starkweather on a lower budget, because they're always on the road and they're just trapped,
Right.
I mean, that's why we have the Hollywood movies like California, or I think Natural Born Killers was loosely inspired by.
Right. Yeah, exactly. It's a story that by its very nature is kind of bigger in scope, and yet the movie itself as it exists is very small. I think they did a great job for, basically having virtually no money. But I get that would probably be one. And there's other things, of course, out there but those things.
I was going to ask, was Badlands, the Terrence Malick movie, based on Starkweather too?
Yeah.
Okay. It's interesting because I don't think there's been like a big Hollywood movie that's like based on Starkweather. All the movies that have come out from Hollywood,
right?
They're all like loosely inspired, whether it's California, Badlands, Natural Born Killers. It would be interesting if Hollywood actually tried to do the actual story.
It kind of goes back to the Ed Gein thing. Like all of these things they're so loosely based upon something, and you're like, well, just tell the actual story. And I guess that's kind of what I mean, is that in my mind, I'm thinking Badlands or Natural Born Killers, and the movie that. And again, I don't mean to speak ill of the film, and because I think they did a great job. But again, it just feels. I always felt like that was a movie that could have been just bigger. Let's face it, they use a lot of the same. They're supposed to be driving from state to state, and it's all basically shot on the same highway.
This is an odd question, but I was thinking about it because Chuck and I talked about it when I had him on, which is we were talking about like the idea of moral responsibility when covering these topics in film. Do you feel any moral responsibility in screenwriting when you're doing something that's based on a true story or true events? I mean, there's no right or wrong answer to this. I'm just curious.
I mean, I think that's why I've always sort of tried to tell the stories as truthfully as I can, is to the degree that I can know that I'm telling the truth, is that's the honesty, is that you take the story and you tell the story as it occurred as closely as possible. I don't know that I would attach morality to that, as much as it's just telling the story truthfully. Like, again, it's, I don't know, if I was Stephen Ambrose writing a book about World War II, you don't really want to embellish stuff. You just tell the story as truthfully as you can.
In closing, are there any projects that you can tease? I know it's not, I have a lot of directors on and they're like, I can't talk about this, or I have to take it out afterwards because they've said too much. But if there is anything you can tease without getting in trouble.
I have a long sort of gestating Moore's Murders project that
is that Ian Brady and
precisely,
Myra?
Myra Hindley, yeah.
Yeah.
That we took a very different approach to the script. It's not basically the story. Well, I probably shouldn't be saying this, but we just take a very different approach to the Moore's Murders story. And that's due to shoot in the UK, knock on wood.
I would really like to see that because I think the movies that have been done on the Moore's Murders are kind of hit and miss, or they take a particular perspective. I'd like to see a different take on it.
Well, it's certainly that. And I'm, always in conversations with people about things that's one thing to your point, I probably shouldn't really talk about.
Okay. If I have to cut it out, you can tell me if I should cut it out.
No, it's not that. It's just, plus there's also, not that I'm the most superstitious guy in the world, but I don't like to talk about things until there's actually something to talk about.
Fair enough.
But I'll keep doing what I do, and hopefully they result in movies.
Are there any serial killers that you wouldn't want to do a screenplay of?
Well, that kind of gets back to the Moore's Murders thing, and like why I say we took a different approach is because when you start getting into anything involving children, the victimology, you have to suddenly become very, very aware. Years ago, I remember. Yeah, have you ever heard of Albert Fish?
Yes.
The older fellow.
Killing little girls. Yeah, real dark.
Right. Exactly. And his pathology is kind of fascinating, but again, you kind of get into territory.
He engaged in cannibalism, I think, too, of some sort.
I think a bit, yeah. You have to. Not that I would ever shy away necessarily from material, but there's a certain reality there that you want to be conscious or conscientious of. But I mean, I guess the short answer is that, like, yes, there are things I would probably not want to do, but the longer answer is that, like, not really. I mean, unless something truly seemed to be so abhorrent, I guess I wouldn't want to do it. But then again, then the challenge becomes, well, how do you figure out how to tell that story? How do you figure out how to tell the abhorrent story?
Are there any that you wouldn't want to do unless if there was proper money, I think you would do it. But are there any that you wouldn't want to do just because, oh God, this sounds boring?
Oh, absolutely. That's that part of the conversations that I've been having is about, like, that's what I kind of earlier when I was talking about the idea of trying to figure out a serial killer that the movie doesn't exist, but that they're actually kind of an interesting story. Because again, a lot of these guys they're not just bad people. They're in many cases, they're just kind of pathetic and boring. And even though some of their actions are, horrific, but like the story itself, to the degree that you could ever describe a serial killer as like mundane and boring, but not infrequently they are mundane and boring. So it's not that sounds odd, I'm sure, but it's not that easy to find a serial killer story that's also interesting.
Right. Yeah, I just want to see. I long for the day where we can see like a movie about the Night Stalker, where the scene of him getting chased down by people in the streets that recognize him. I've always wanted to see that scene played out in a movie. I feel like that would be a great Matthew Bright scene, darkly comedic. The big one I want to see is, are you familiar with Carl Panzram?
Oh, yeah, sure.
Panzram, I wish they would make, because there's that James Woods TV movie, but Panzram would be a great subject for a movie of some sort nowadays.
You're right. I may have to I have a Panzram book that I need to pull out now that you've. I may totally steal that from you. So
You should get it made.
you can get. Perhaps you can have like a co-producer credit or something. But that's a good call, Panzram.
There's so many that you could do. It's wild.
But again, going back to the idea of ones though that are interesting, and because Panzram, isn't he the fellow when he was like strapped into the electric chair? He said something like, "Let's get this over with, you Hoosier bastards."
Yes, yeah. I think he was hung.
Or
But he
hung.
said that right before he got hung. Yeah.
But, in terms of a guy that went out.
Let's get this over with, you Hoosier bastards. I could kill you all with my damn bare hands. Yeah.
There you go. See, interesting. That's a character I can work with. See.
Anything else that I missed that you want to mention here? I think we covered everything.
I think so. I mean, inevitably, will I think of something later and be like, "Oh, why didn't I mention that?" I'm sure. But...
We'll have to reconvene again, maybe around Halloween time, do another episode on these things.
Absolutely.
Maybe we can get more into the writing process or granular sort of questions about the craft, structure, and whatnot. Because I actually have a lot of listeners that are just getting into screenwriting or filmmaking that would love to hear more about that.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, in terms of subjects I can certainly talk about. If people are interested in listening, certainly.
Well, hey, thank you again, Stephen Johnston, for coming on Parallax Views.
Well, thanks you for having me, man. Hopefully we'll continue the conversation soon.
A special thanks to my $10 and above tier supporters on Patreon, who make this show possible with their generous donations. Producers' credits shout out to those supporters: Aaron, Jeremy, Matt, Big Bob's Beepers, James, Enoch, David, Sadad, Tristan, Bob, Eva, Miriam, West Bank Robbery Pod, B. Lund, Transnatural Perspectives Podcast, Dan, Nick, Elliot, Fabian, Tom, Arlen, Bo, Spartacus, James, G, Jamie, Will, JC, WV, Sutra, Orc, Catherine, Darko, Nathan, Holland, Dan, Mark, Chase, Olm, Gary, Emilia, Nick, Brace, Michael, and Brian. Please join those listeners in supporting me at the $10 and above tier of my Patreon page, patreon.com/parallaxviews, if you'd like your very own producer's credit on each and every edition of the program.
Until next time, you've been listening to Parallax Views with Parallax Views to Parallax Views with Parallax Views.
The way out is not simply to say, don't do it, just to prohibit. It's nothing else. If we don't do it, others will be doing it like crazy. So, we have to confront the problem. But no, basically, I know of the great anxieties, problems, new forms of control, but it's also new forms of freedom. This is why I always emphasize that internet and all this new digital stuff, it's a very ambiguous phenomenon, but it's the field of struggle. New forms of enslavement, but at the same time, new incredible forms of freedom. We have to accept the fight with no nostalgia for old, allegedly more authentic communities or whatever. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid.